For nearly a century, there was an entire system of law in America built not to ensure justice, but to flat-out deny it. It was a system designed by its very nature to create a permanent underclass. So, okay, let's dive into this really complex and absolutely crucial chapter of American history, the Jim Crow system.
To really get your head around Jim Crow, this is probably the best way to think about it. It wasn't just, a single obstacle. It was a race that was fundamentally rigged right from the very start. A system where the rules were intentionally written to make it pretty much impossible for one group of people to ever really compete, let alone win.
So what was Jim Crow exactly? Well, here's the thing. It wasn't just one law. It was this suffocating, tangled-up patchwork of thousands of different state and local rules. Think of it less like a single wall and more like a giant spider's web touching every single part of life. And the goal? To put white supremacy back in charge after the Civil War and strip African Americans of any political or economic power they'd gained.
To understand how a system like this could even happen, we have to look at what came right before it. It was this brief, really hopeful moment that was, well, quickly and brutally shut down.
What's so striking when you look at this timeline is just how fast that promise of freedom completely fell apart. For a little while, during Reconstruction, you had black men voting, even holding public office. But then, in 1877, this backroom political deal pulls federal troops, the very people protecting those rights, out of the South. And that created this huge power vacuum. Southern states moved in fast. And the final nail in the coffin? It comes in 1896 with a Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, which basically gave the whole system a legal green light.
Yeah, that Supreme Court decision was built on 3 little words that would be used to justify segregation for the next 60 years. 3 words that were, let's be honest, a complete and total lie in practice.
See, this is the promise. This is what was supposed to happen. Ratified after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was meant to guarantee citizenship and, maybe most importantly, equal protection of the laws for everyone, including formerly enslaved people. That was supposed to be the standard.
So you see this massive contradiction right here. In the Plessy case, the Supreme Court basically argued that, yeah, you can enforce separation, and it doesn't violate that equal protection thing as long as the separate facilities were equal. And just like that, they created this legal fiction of separate but equal, which became the bedrock for the entire Jim Crow system.
And this photo, wow, it just says it all, doesn't it? This is from Durham, North Carolina. You see a cafe with 2 doors, literally side by side. One for white patrons, and a separate, clearly smaller one for colored. The doctrine might have been separate but equal, but the reality, as you can plainly see, was always separate and profoundly unequal.
So the Jim Crow system was kind of like a machine with 3 big interlocking gears. Each one was designed to control a different part of life for African Americans. Let's break down how it all worked.
It all started with political control. The whole system depended on taking away the right to vote. So states used all these different tactics. You had so-called literacy tests that weren't actually about reading at all. Black applicants would be asked to interpret some super complex legal text, and the white registrar had all the power to just fail them. Then you had poll taxes, fees that were designed to keep poor people, both black and white, from voting. And then, maybe the most cynical move of all were these grandfather clauses. They basically said that white men didn't have to take the tests if their grandfathers could vote before 1867, a time when, of course, almost no African Americans could. And then there was social control. This is where the laws just become completely and often cruelly absurd. I mean, just look at this. In Alabama, it was illegal for a black person and a white person to play checkers together. In Florida, even the textbooks for the segregated schools had to be kept in separate warehouses. In Georgia, segregation literally followed you from cradle to grave. It was illegal to be buried in the same cemetery. This was all about enforcing a racial hierarchy in every single tiny interaction of daily life.
And that 3rd gear was economic control. The main goal here was to create a permanent, cheap labor force. You had the sharecropping system, which trapped so many families in a cycle of debt to the landowner that was nearly impossible to climb out of. Black workers were shut out of better-paying factory jobs. And then there was the federal policy of redlining, which made it impossible for black families to get mortgages to buy homes in a lot of neighborhoods, systematically denying them the main way people built generational wealth in America.
But, and this is a really important but, this system did not go unchallenged. No way. The fight against it would grow into one of the greatest social and legal movements in American history. It was a decades-long struggle, and it was fought in courtrooms and on the streets.
This right here, this is the beginning of the end for legal Jim Crow. In 1954, in the landmark case Brown versus the Board of Education, the Supreme Court unanimously struck down segregation in schools. And by declaring that separate was inherently unequal, they just destroyed the entire legal foundation of the whole Jim Crow system. The moral pressure from the civil rights movement, really kicked into high gear by that Brown decision, finally pushed Congress to act, and they brought down two giant legislative hammers. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 was the death blow to public segregation, making it illegal to discriminate in restaurants, hotels, and jobs. Then, just 1 year later, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 came in and directly attacked disenfranchisement, outlawing things like literacy tests for good.
So the laws are gone, but that doesn't just mean the effects of a century of systematic discrimination vanished into thin air. So the big question we have to ask is, why does this history still matter so much today?
And that's really the critical question, isn't it? I mean, the legal structure of Jim Crow was torn down, but did all the social and economic damage it caused just disappear when the president signed a new law?
Well, the data suggests the answer is a pretty clear no. This from a Harvard study is fascinating. It shows that even decades later, the states that had Jim Crow laws consistently have lower levels of what's called social capital. And what's that? It's basically the trust, the networks, and the community bonds that make a society work well. And it kind of makes sense, right? When you have laws that actively pit neighbor against neighbor and destroy trust for generations, you weaken the entire social fabric. That legacy doesn't just go away. The study suggests this deep fracture has had a real, lasting, and measurable effect.
And that brings us right back to our original analogy of the race. The legal signs that enforce the rigged rules, those have been taken down. But the legacy of that system, the wealth gaps from redlining, the fractured communities we just saw in the data, that's left to terrain that is far from a level playing field. The laws are gone, for sure, but understanding their deep and lasting impact is the first step toward figuring out how to clear the hurdles that are still very much there.